If you ask my son, he would say yes. I did talk to him and whatnot, but I never really sat down and said, here are the rules and all. I think the students that I taught, as well as some of my nieces and nephews, I certainly would have talked to them about what happens in life and what's going on with racism, and had that kind of talk with them. I don't really recall a talk from my parents. More of anything, it was, don't allow yourself to get caught up in something. If you go to jail, my dad always said he's not coming to get me. We got to figure out a way to get out of jail, that kind of thing. His life was concerned with how he can make a living for his family and whatnot, and he wanted them to be sure that they did not do anything that would mess up the name, and that's it. I've got friends that have talked to me about the fact that their parents sat them down and talked about what happens and the kinds of things that could happen if you got caught up in something involving race. Yeah. In growing up, I grew up in Aiken over on Sumter Street, about a half a block from Schofield School. Before those projects came along, we lived in the middle of the block, and then those projects were built and whatnot. So I basically walked less than a block to school every day. And then before that, the Aiken graded school. I was aware of the differences that existed between black schools and white schools, but we had great teachers who taught us that we needed to get an education, and so that's sort of how I sort of set my sight, and I didn't worry about those things that I had no control over. My parents were had menial jobs. My mother ironed clothes and washed clothes for the Northerners that came down and whatnot. My dad was a caretaker, which meant that he raked yards and cut hedges and took care of the grounds and all of this and all. So both my mother had a third grade education and my dad had a fifth grade education. The idea of me going to college was one of the furthest things in my mind. I didn't have a clue that I would wind up one day down at Claflin. The only thing that stuck with me from my parents was, you have the opportunity to be whatever you want to be. It's left up to you. Where we were going to get the money from for me to go to school, I didn't have a clue, but somehow all of that happened. But as far as race relations, I remember seeing right there in the block of Sumter Street between Barnwell and Richland Avenue, I remember seeing the Ku Klux Klan out in the middle of the park and whatnot, either setting cross on fire or whatever. And we, of course, were terrified and did not go out and whatnot. We watched the crosses burned and whatnot, and it was not. It was only just to intimidate poor, uneducated, in many cases, blacks and whatnot, and so that's what they did. But by going to school at Aiken graded, at the time it was we called it the free school. We're going to Aiken graded school up on the top of the hill where the swimming pool is now, and then going to Schofield, we had teachers who taught us about, one, getting an education, not being terrified, knowing that in truth the law was on our side. We didn't have a lot of police protection, but we did know that we weren't going to be abused in the way we were reading about others and whatnot. So Aiken has always been, in my opinion, a nice place to be from, and we were all, relationships were such that whites knew their place, blacks knew their place, and it never festered to the point that we had the kind of race riots. And so it was always a wonderful town to be a part of, and I like being a part of it to this day. I was fortunate in growing up that I had teachers, even though it was a segregated school, they too, like my parents, made education the most important thing that I needed to deal with. The civil rights stuff that happened to me happened more because of my senior year, my freshman year in college, and being in Orangeburg and being, it was right at the time that the civil rights movements were all taking off. And as a member of the college chapter of the NAACP, I got involved in a demonstration in the spring of 1960, and that's how I really got involved in the civil rights movement. You need to have in books those things that were wrong. We need to talk about them. And children, let me tell you, in my opinion, people aren't born with prejudices. That's taught to them. And somebody has to teach the children that that is not right. We've got to teach black children it is not right for you now to think that because what was done to your parents and grandparents that all of a sudden you have a right to do the same thing to someone else. They need to understand that. Young white children need to understand that you are no better than anyone else. You have, everyone is entitled to the same rights and whatnot, and it needs to be something that is taught and whatnot. I just don't believe that young white children were born with the attitude that we are superior to blacks or to any other race. And so we have to make sure that if we're going to educate children, that they are educated in a way that they realize that that is not the way God intended for our lives to be.